This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On?
You always find that so amusing, Danny. You
because you know what? I honestly
never-ending question.
Well, but exactly. And remember, I did not really like the name, and yet it encapsulates pretty much every conversation we have. So, Mark, what the hell is going on this week?
What the hell's going on is apparently I was right about the name of the podcast, like I am on so many other things that we discuss, and you were wrong. Yeah. And so we had a podcast the other week about an event that I had without you on China, and so you went and retaliated and had an event without me, which was also outstanding.
Thank you.
On October 7th and what's happening in the Middle East. And so we're going to bring that to you today, the conversation. And so I get my 2 cents in early because I'm not in the conversation, but talking about the anniversary of October 7th and where we are in this battle between Israel and Hamas, and now Israel and Hezbollah, and now increasingly Israel and Iran as we wait for the much promised and much vaunted Israeli retaliation for the no longer unprecedented strike on Israel, because it's the second time that Iran has directly attacked Israel on Biden's watch. First time ever that's happened in history. But what's going on with that, Danny? Is Israel going to kick some ass and take some names? What's going on here?
Well, if Israel listened to us,
as they would be wise to do.
As they would be wise to do, as all the conspiracy theorists suggest that they do, and yet they don't. Look, if the Israelis listened to us, they would take this opportunity. We had a great conversation at this event, and it was not a rehearsal, a reiteration of the discussion about what happened on October 7th, because we've talked about this. We know what happened. The world understands what happened. But now, in the wake of 2 failed Iranian attacks on Israel, in the wake of Israel's, I would say, virtual decapitation of Hamas and total decapitation of Hezbollah, we are really looking at a moment in time that is, I think, special. Not so much because the Israelis are winning against their adversaries, but because their adversaries have never seemed so weak. And what is important, and this is what you point to, is not, again, what the opportunity is for the Israelis, but what it is that the Americans are telling the Israelis not to do. And my question, and I want to know what you think about this, is, are the Americans telling the Israelis to hold back in their retaliation against Iran because
the election?
Exactly, because of the election.
That's fascinating. So first of all, it's not the Americans that are telling them to hold back, because there's plenty of Americans who are telling them not to hold back. It's the Biden administration. And I would, because we're Americans.
Yes.
and we are saying, go for it. But it's not only that they're telling them to hold back, they're telling them publicly to hold back. I mean, Joe Biden went out and said publicly, don't hit Iranian nuclear sites. And then he said, and don't hit their oil capacity. And then he said, and don't hit their oil storage. It's like, well, why are you so concerned about not hitting oil? Well, because maybe the price of gas would go up right before the election. Of course, it has something to do with the election. They don't want a major international crisis right before an election. So that's certainly an element of it. But they've been terrified of escalation long before the election came into view. As our friend Fred Kagan likes to say, we're run by a government of PhDs in escalation studies. And they don't seem to understand that the way to avoid escalation is to deter escalation by being willing to go to the top of the escalation ladder right away, as opposed to being afraid of inching up it. And what Israel has done in taking out the entire Hezbollah leadership and 2/3, as I understand it, of their missile and rocket capabilities, and decapitating the 2 of the 3 top Hamas leaders, one of them in Tehran, in a government guest house. I mean, this is the greatest counterterrorism operation ever carried out in modern history. And they need to finish. We should be telling them, finish it. Finish them. Finish. So we don't have to deal with this problem anymore. But to restore deterrence. And we're telling them the opposite because, well, Kamala has to get elected.
So, yes. I mean, I think for the Biden administration, there's a lot going on there. We need to underscore to our listeners that there is more than this going on. So we have the Israelis continuing to operate in Gaza. We have the Israelis operating in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. We have the Israelis operating mostly by air, although also in a recent ground incursion, incredibly, in Syria, where the Iranians are obviously the dominant force. And we have the Israelis promising retaliation against the Iranians at a time of the Israelis' choosing. So what is the Biden administration doing? The Biden administration is saying, number one, we know you need to retaliate against the Iranians. Please don't hit what you specified, but especially please don't hit their nuclear sites because something will happen, and I want to come back to that. But they're also now threatening the Israelis. If you don't do more in Gaza to support humanitarian aims in Gaza, we're going to stop sending you any weaponry. Now, we should not interpret that as a response to anything going on in Gaza, because the Israelis are now allowing through,
The response to what's happening in Dearborn.
Well, again, look, you and I talk a lot about leverage, and the Biden administration.
You're correct.
Yeah, a Freudian slip.
You are correct. It's not just Freudian slip; it's the same damn people.
Yeah. Well, so the Biden administration has a lot of leverage against the Israelis. The Israelis are very dependent on U.S. ammunition resupply. The Biden administration has delivered unprecedented, right? THAAD. Stephen, what is THAAD? Theater High Altitude Area Defense. This is why you should be married, because your husband can tell you what that is. Theater High Altitude Area Defense, which is something that we do not deliver to anybody and anyone who asks for it, to the Israelis to defend against missile attacks of the kind the Iranians are engaged in. Clearly, they are using the tools that are available to them to persuade the Israelis. But damn it, Mark, I mean, what you say is exactly right. Why do you not, at the moment of Iran's greatest vulnerability, their most important proxy, Hezbollah, is right, exactly. Now is the moment, right? Go for their jugular.
Exactly, but and go for the nuclear program. You can have an opportunity. Look, we know that they can't actually eliminate the Iranian nuclear program, but they can set it back a lot.
Right.
And the Iranians have given them the pretext to do it.
Right.
They attacked unprovoked.
Do not. The most important thing is not that they've given them the pretext. The most important thing is not that the Israelis have the ability. The most important thing is that the entire Biden administration theory of the case, which is that this will ignite a regional war, is, we have an explicit rating, bullshit. Right.
Let's say it in unison. Look, this is a gift to the United States and Israel, this attack, because it literally failed in spectacular fashion, except for that poor Palestinian that was walking down the street and got hit by the debris of an Iranian ballistic missile. But literally, no Israelis died in this attack, and they made this is a unprovoked attack because Israel didn't attack Iran. They attacked Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now Israel has every right to go after and retaliate in the timing and fashion in which it decides. Why would you not take that opportunity to set back the Iranian nuclear program? When we keep hearing that the catastrophic decision to get out of the JCPOA has put Iran within weeks of having a nuclear capability if they wanted to break out. Well, okay, make it months, make it years. We can do it. We've got the pretext. It's like, the Iranians have literally walked into a trap and we're going to let them out. It's strategic incompetence.
100%.
And they are terrified, and they are more afraid of getting of escalation than we are. They know that if they did something really damaging to Israel, that we would have to get involved and they would get their asses kicked. They don't want to go to war with us. They are not. Their military is not that capable, as you pointed out. And I would recommend everybody go listen to Danny's interview with Robert Dorr on his podcast, which was just brilliant analysis of the situation. But as you pointed out, they got their asses kicked by Saddam Hussein. This is not a great, powerful military. They're good at funding terrorists around the world, but they are not exactly a massive military power, as evidenced by the fact that they've now attacked Israel twice and done almost no damage. So, they don't want to get into a war with us. And they don't want to get into a war with Israel. So take them out. And by the way, if Donald J. Trump was president, he would do what he did after
Mark,
the
who just voted.
Yes, I did just vote. And he would tell them what he told them after Qasem Soleimani, which is that if you they absorb this attack, don't retaliate, or you're going to pay a price that you don't want to pay.
So I will give you one of my favorite quotes. This is a great conversation with three people who I really admire and respect a lot from this event that we're about to play for you. But I have to say, for pithiness, nobody has it on Dave Deptula, former general in the Air Force, and God knows, they know what they're talking about. So I asked Dave, and I'll read this to you all before I read their bios, but I said to Dave, we talk a lot about Iranian capabilities through their proxies, and we talk a lot about Iranian air defenses, and we talk a lot about their nuclear weapons program. We don't really talk a lot about their Air Force. And Dave looks at everybody on the panel and he goes, piece of cake, put me in, coach. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, this is a great event. Why don't you introduce our guests to today, because I just love this conversation, and let's go to it.
Good. Well, we're lucky to have such wonderful people who are friends of AEI. So in alphabetical order, our dear friend Elliott Abrams, who's a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was previously deputy assistant to the president, deputy national security advisor in the George W. Bush administration. Lieutenant General Dave A. Deptula is the dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, principal attack planner for Operation Desert Storm, the air campaign commander of the no-fly zones over Iraq, and the director of the air campaign over Afghanistan. And Eyal Hulata is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He previously served as Israel's national security advisor and head of Israel's National Security Council.
Here's Danny's conversation.
Without Mark.
Me.
We're here today to talk about the one-year anniversary of the attacks of October 7th. I made a note for myself at the top of my page because President Biden had a rabbi by the White House to, say a prayer on this anniversary, and he and Jill Biden stood there, but they did not say anything, and then they issued a press release, but they didn't mention that there are 4 American hostages still being held. 4 of them alive, 3 dead. Omer Neutrin, Edan Alexander, Keith Siegel, and Sagi Dekel-Chen are the 4 living, we hope, American hostages. We shouldn't forget them. So rather than talk about the last year, what I've said to our panelists today is I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about what's ahead. Each of them has, I think, a lot to add, unique perspectives. There are things that we know are going to happen. For example, the Israelis have said that they are going to retaliate against the Islamic Republic of Iran for the attack of October 1st, 181 missiles, one poor Palestinian schmo killed by falling debris. And so they are planning to retaliate. We know that's ahead. We know operations are widening in Lebanon. But this is a conflict that's gone on for a year. It's the longest that Israel has fought. And we are also in the midst of a political season. I know most of you aren't paying attention because, it's Washington, and what's an election, every 4 years. But this is an environment that's also going to shape our responses. We have 2 very different prospects, I think, in front of us in terms of either Vice President Harris or President Trump becoming the next president of the United States. Presents several different futures for how the United States will deal with all of this. So perhaps if I may start with you, Dave, General Deptula. You went into Gaza with the IDF, and you wrote a wonderful piece in Forbes about the operation. But one of the things that a lot of us are wondering is, as we see this, is this a sustainable operation? Can they continue at war for another several months, even potentially more than that, into next year? Do they have what's necessary? Can they rely on their reserves? Give us your sort of perspective.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here and for that question. From my perspectives, and this is only my own opinion, obviously the real answer to your question only resides with the leadership of Israel, but they have shown the competence and the capability to carry on 2 major operations. And so my short answer to your question is yes, they can. With respect to Gaza, one of the biggest things that struck me in traveling the entire length of the Philadelphia corridor and watching the engineering units uncover an average of 2 tunnels a day as they moved from the Med over to the border of Gaza to Israel as well as Egypt, is that if they're going to stay anywhere in Gaza, it needs to be along that Gaza-Egyptian border, because basically, and it comes down to something as simple as this, that is the venue through which Hamas has been able to acquire its weapons. So whatever future unfolds, it makes absolute logical sense for the IDF to stay there and monitor that border to assure that Hamas has no other access to weapons, which ultimately will get them to the point where they will not have the capacity to conduct any sort of operation on the order of what happened 10/7 of last year. Again, there are all kinds of complications and additions here, but fundamentally, I think that's what the Israeli Defense Force and the leadership of Israel has to draw a line on, is their ability to control that border.
I'm sorry, I was going to move on, but I have to ask you, one of the big components of all of the recent peace proposals or ceasefire proposals has been Israel pulling out of that Philadelphia corridor. And there has been a suggestion, I don't know whether it's true, and perhaps Eyal or Elliott have a perspective on this, but there were certainly reported suggestions that there was a divide inside the Israeli government between the military and the politicals, with the military saying that they could give up the Philadelphia and the politicals suggesting that that wasn't at all a possibility. I've never understood that. I mean, because it's exactly as you describe, it is the lifeline of Hamas and an escape route as well for Hamas. How does this?
Well, all I can say, Danny, is that I'm not privy to those discussions at that level, but I can tell you that the IDF leadership that I spoke with in those travels was adamant in the context of being able to maintain control of that corridor.
Okay. And I wanted to ask Elliott about politics, but now jumping down the rabbit hole that I always do, showing absolutely no moderator's discipline, I apologize. Eyal, I'm sorry, what's going on? What is happening inside? Well, I'm serious because we're in a pause period right now because of the election, because everybody's focused internally, because of all the hurricanes. But that's not going to last forever, and the pressure will be renewed on Israel to come to some sort of agreement. 21 days with Mohammed and 14 days with Yahya, and how will this work?
So first, I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Danny, for inviting me to share a stage with such distinguished speakers. Maybe I'll start by saying that if you had asked the average Israeli, even national security experts before that, if Israel was capable of fighting a year-long war such as we did, the answer would be that the IDF was not built for that, not prepared for that, not trained for that, not equipped for that. And therefore, the IDF over the years, or the Israel establishment over the years in general, have devised various sorts of solutions to compensate for the fact that we have a relatively small military compared to the length of borders that we need to defend and the number of adversaries that we need to fight against. And I'll get to the Philadelphia issue just in a second, but just to understand how complicated it is, the eastern border of Israel with Jordan, just on the West Bank area, is more than 10 times longer than that of the Rafah crossing in Philadelphia. And there is IDF presence there all the time. And the amount of weaponry that is smuggled into the West Bank, Iranian funded and shipped into the West Bank throughout the years, but specifically in the last 6 months or so, since the Iranians really ramped up what they're doing in Jordan in general and in the West Bank, is immense. And this is before we talked about the border with Lebanon and the Radwan capabilities there. The IDF had over the years the need to devise various sorts of solution to how to be able to balance the number of troops that we keep in each place and so forth. Now, I must say, by calling spade a spade, this system that the IDF has built, or what evolved of it over the years, completely failed our civilians on October 7th, to say the least. The IDF was not there to protect the civilians on the barrier, and Hamas was able to penetrate extensively into more than 30 of our communities and butcher more than 1,200 of our people. While doing that, they did not come through underground tunnels. They only came overtly over the fence that we built above. And the reason for that is that over a period of time, Israel has managed to build a very robust subterranean barrier that people are not talking about because people always talk about the failures, not necessarily about the things that have succeeded. And that subterranean barrier that goes as deep as 100 feet as necessary is about 3 or 4 feet wide of concrete, reinforced concrete with sensors, has been able to prevent Hamas from digging tunnels underground into Israel. And the reason I'm saying that is because, of course, cutting out the lifeline of Hamas for future replenishment is the most important thing other than dismantling Hamas at the end of this war. And the vulnerability point is the barrier or the border between Gaza and Sinai. When the senior IDF officials are saying that there are other solutions, what they mean is that given a proper barrier underground, a robust official Rafah crossing that needs to be rebuilt because most of the weaponry that Hamas got over the years was actually smuggled overtly above ground in tunnels, in trucks, through the Rafah crossing because the Egyptians weren't monitoring it carefully. There was no screening equipment. The IDF did not have access to it. The Americans didn't really care. And Israel, unfortunately, overlooked many of that. So there are solutions that would allow that. And the reason this is important from a military standpoint is because the IDF remembers very well what happened when we actually were present in the Philadelphia corridor before the disengagement. And in several of those places, it's a really narrow corridor. Of course, now it's wider because we've bulldozed through the Rafah neighborhoods that are close to that border, but still it's very, very close. And the ability of Hamas to snipe over time, I'm not talking what will happen after a month or after a year. The question is what will happen after 4 years and further up. This is a vulnerability point, operationally a vulnerability point for the IDF. So I will not contradict what you're saying because, of course, I would want that sector to be secured very, very much. I think there could be other solutions that would allow the IDF not to need to invest also manpower there because there are other borders that I must say worry me even more. We're all focused on Gaza because, of course, Hamas were able to do this horrific thing on October 7. But I'm very worried about what's happening with arms smuggling into the West Bank, and we cannot resolve this just by these kind of tools because it's a very long border, and the IDF will need to operate there very much. So I gave you an answer while deflecting the political anger for it. I hope you appreciate that, because what's interesting with those discussions is that there's always the right answer and then there's the real answer. So in this case, I gave you the right answer. The real answer, of course, is there is a political element to it and questions associated with whether or not continuing this war and for how long serves various interests to it. But since I don't want to believe that there is any Israeli person that would extend it unnecessarily, I think it's important to stick to the real issues, because once they're resolved, hopefully we can reach also arrangements.
Elliott?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me here. Last fall, soon after October 7th, weeks after, I helped organize a project on the day after. This one happened to be Vandenberg Coalition and JINSA, but there are a number of others. We wanted to move very quickly. We went to Israel at the end of October.
Yeah.
For the first visit, we went back later. Why did we move so quickly? Because it was obvious that you needed to come up with a solution for the day after quickly, because the day after would come reasonably quickly. Well, now it's a year later. There is no day after. I mean, the war continues. I've read, I think, or at least skimmed most of the proposals, and nobody really has a practical answer. I mean, looking at it today and asking, well, okay, you need a government in Gaza. You need security in Gaza. Who's going to do that? And everybody said last year, well, obviously, you don't want it to be Israel, you don't want it to be Hamas. Palestinian Authority's not able to do it. I think on this subject, we are no further advanced than we were on October 8th, which is very unfortunate because we're going to need an answer unless the IDF stays there semi-permanently. I would hope that before October 7th, 2025, there's some work actually being done on establishing a kind of government in Gaza that can keep people alive, hospitals, schools, food, and preserve order. But we're no closer than we were a year ago.
Which is absolutely remarkable. But I think there's also been a change in attitude about this, perhaps in Israel, about the need for Israel to have the responsibility to do all of the thinking about this. It has struck me forcibly that we need to do some thinking about this, and we have not done any serious thinking, nor have we reflected on the fact that in the 32 years since Oslo and the hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money that we have poured into the West Bank and Gaza, not to speak of the hundreds of billions we've poured into the United Nations, UNRWA, etc., we have managed to build nothing other than a terrorist state. And not just an efficient terrorist state, but a terrorist state with no infrastructure, no governance, no school system, no decent economy, no decent borders, and corruption that makes the olden days look like hikers.
In a way, one could say that we're actually, on this, worse off than we were a year ago. Judging from what one reads in the paper, the more serious Arab states, take the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, taking a harder line now.
Right.
In saying that they will participate in rebuilding Gaza only if there is an absolute commitment, time-bound commitment, to use the Saudi and Blinken formula, a time-bound commitment to the establishment of a Palestinian state, which I agree with you, seems to me ludicrous given the state of Gaza and the state of the PA.
Well, not to speak of the fact that it was my impression from our last 3 administrations that the United States was opposed to the idea of nation building, which is what that is. Dave, you had something?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to interject with respect to what you described in terms of the diversion of all of those resources that went into Gaza for purposes of good being diverted by Hamas for purposes of evil, which takes me back to why I personally believe interdiction of the capacity and capability of Iran to continue to supply Hamas with those capabilities is so important. And yes, I acknowledge that there are plenty of technological ways to halt operations that have been occurring underground, but I think that as alternatives to coming up with some sort of peace plan evolve, you can do that over a period of time.
Right.
So you have forces there initially, you transition to technological means, which then allows the withdrawal of some, but you do it over a period which makes sense, where you just don't automatically leave.
Must be
I
robust.
think that would be
Definitely.
imprudent.
And I agree with that, of course.
And you need the Egyptians. So you're going to get the Egyptians?
Well, I think there's a question there, of course, for Israel. There's also a question there for the United States of America. I'm not in a position to propose policy for the US, but I am in a position to ask questions. So who are the strategic allies of the United States in the region, and what are their obligations, and in what way is this done? I know what are the demands from Israel, and I know sometimes how difficult it is as National Security Advisor working with this administration. We used to keep our arguments behind closed doors because I think that was more effective than doing it on the outside, but there were disagreements nonetheless. Okay, I think the question to Egypt should resign here just as much as it would be in Israel. When just a few weeks ago, we all read that the US has approved the new aid package to Egypt, and also they actually increased it and released funds that were previously frozen because of human rights. Now, all of it has been approved. One would ask, what did the US get in return, and specifically in the context of ending the war and putting pressure on Hamas? I hope someone has an answer to that.
Yes, I don't.
And I would ask the same question about Qatar, when a few months ago there was an agreement or an announcement to renew the base in Doha for a decade, while the US is saying that there is significant assistance by the Qataris to release the hostages, including 7 of which are Americans, 4 of them alive. So, I mean, it's a fair question, Elliott. I think we need to think on how this regional arrangement would look in the future. Maybe to go, Danny, to what you said in the beginning. There are shared interests among the pragmatic countries in the region. But there are also conflicting interests between those countries in the region. There are definitely conflicting interests between Israel and Egypt. There are conflicting interests between Israel and Jordan. But those are the 2 countries that we have peace agreements with. There are maybe less, but still remain conflicting interests between Israel and the Gulf countries. We have not normalized with Saudi Arabia yet. But collectively, what can be done with an understanding that the 2 radical forces of the region, first being the Islamic Republic of Iran, and second being the Islamic Brotherhood, or the Sunni political Islam, there are shared interests among all of those countries because these 2 forces are subversive to all of those pragmatic leaders and to the national security interests. How do we mobilize this into something that is concrete, that could build a fundamentally different Middle East for the benefit of all? I think this is the question at hand. An arrangement with Egypt is one of them. Arrangement with Jordan is a second one. Normalization with Saudi Arabia would be a third. What's going to happen with Lebanon now that Hezbollah is as weak as anyone can imagine? In the crowd is Jim Jeffrey. We've spoken extensively when I was in previous positions, and Jim was serving in the administration, about how we can reshape Lebanon. Could we have imagined a better opportunity than we have now to have the Lebanese take over their country and kick out Hezbollah and Iranian presence? I'm not sure we're going to have another good opportunity like this in years to come. So this all goes back to the same question. There are, of course, issues that we need to resolve and transition periods to all of them, but are we collectively committed to a new Middle East or not?
No, good. We're not.
We're not?
No. Look, I mean, I have the answer to your question. What does this require? This requires leadership, and it requires vision. I'm not going to tell you that we have any on tap for the future, because it requires the kind of difficult commitment and the kind of consistency that the United States is increasingly incapable of, in my opinion. But let's talk about the big bad guy, Iran. So, you rightly say, Hezbollah has never been in a weaker position, or at least not in many decades, for sure, and has never been as obviously weak. The same can be said for Iran, right? Other than perhaps in 2009, when there was a pretty serious uprising against the regime, the Iranians now look impotent. And not just impotent to their own people, but impotent externally as well. These 2 failed attacks are important. What should happen? We know the administration is pushing back. We know the president, even before speaking to the Israeli prime minister, said the Israelis should not hit the Iranian nuclear sites. What should happen? We have three people who planned, and planned. What should happen?
Well, I will suggest to you what we shouldn't do. Look, deterrence is part of what we're talking about. To deter adversaries from accomplishing actions that are not in our best interest, what you try to do is induce uncertainty in their minds as to whether what they are planning on doing will succeed or not. Well, to do that, you don't tell your adversaries what it is you're planning on doing. So we have a situation where you got the President of the United States publicly stating U.S. preference for Israel don't attack to lessen their nuclear development capabilities. And then the next day comes out and says, oh, no, by the way, don't touch the oil production facilities. And then the next day comes out and says, don't mess with oil storage. Okay, let me step back just a second. If you have those perspectives, great. But how about picking up a secure phone and discussing them in private? Because all it's doing is revealing weakness to the rest of the world in the context of what the U.S. position is. I'm of the camp that, just like you said, Danny, Hezbollah's never been weaker. One could imply that that is the case in the context of the Iranian mullahs as well. And if there was ever a time, I mean, back to your point, that is the obvious one in this room. Iran just launched over 180 ballistic missiles against Israel. Why would you not take advantage of that and respond in a manner which is indicative of the seriousness of what just happened? Now, I get it, and I apologize because I don't want to go down this rat hole, but folks have said, well, to really dismantle their nuclear capability, we need the assistance of the United States. The United States is not ready at this time. Well, I don't know when they would be ready, if not now, because you need to plan for these kinds of opportunities when they arrive. So I get it, but that's not a reason not to respond in a fashion to degrade Iran's ability, which they are on a rapid track to be able to finish their development of nuclear weapons. And just imagine if they put one of those on the top of the next 180 ballistic missiles that they launch.
I think the target list is short in the sense that Israel could try to hit some of the nuclear sites. It could hit the oil industry, oil facilities. It could hit military targets. Last, political targets, decapitation. Now, which of those is best? There's a variable here, which is what can Israel do? And I don't know the answer to that question. If you had asked me whether they could do in 2 weeks what they did in 2 weeks in Lebanon, I have said, no, that's unrealistic. So I don't know what Israel can do with respect to the nuclear program. It's a target that, putting aside what President Biden said, that I think Israeli leaders should think about, because this may be a good opportunity and it may be one of the last opportunities to set back that program a long time. But again, the variable, how much can Israel do? I'm struck by the oil target. It's true that it would help Putin in a way if you assume that oil prices would double or more. It would hurt Xi Jinping, for sure. It would have an impact on our economy, though not necessarily in the short time before the election. Things have to work, prices have to work through, and we do have a strategic petroleum reserve, though it's depleted. So the reason I think about that target is, if you could deprive the regime of significant amounts of oil income, the way, frankly, we were doing with sanctions in the Trump administration, you're not hurting the regime on one day, you're hurting the regime for a very long period of time. And that weakens it, and it reduces the amount of money they have to give to Hezbollah and other proxies. And it maybe makes the Iranian people even angrier at their regime and at what the regime has done to the country, because I think they'll blame the regime more than they would blame, much more than they would blame Israel. So I don't have a view as to what Israel should do, but I would actually kind of say what J.D. Vance did in the Great Debate, which is when Israel makes that decision, we should support it.
Eyal?
So I'll say this. First, to the question of
We
what,
want only classified
yes,
information.
I know.
It's just between us.
Yeah, it's all amongst friends and very simple topics. So as for Israeli capabilities, I think Israel can do a lot more than people think. I will say that the fact that our Air Force has been very, very busy in other issues over the last year doesn't make it a clear cut to decide to do something like that. It's more difficult than to bomb Hulata port, because in such complicated Air Force operations, as the general will know, the distance is the least problematic part, right? The pilots just need to stay awake. What's really difficult is when they engage, and engaging Iran is more difficult than engaging the Houthis over Hulata. So that's point number one. Second point has to do with how should we think and how Israel should think, and I think does think, about the administration's position. And I must say that I totally agree. I mean, I wish things will be done differently, but that's the way they have been conducted, and that is it. I will say, though, that regardless of what I think, we must take that into account. The fact that Israel is increasingly becoming a partisan issue in Washington is not good for the long term for Israel's security. And whatever we do in a single night in Iran or a week, there's going to be not only a day after, but a year after and a decade after. And for Israel, regardless of what we may think about the position of a single administration at this point, to do something so dramatic without coordination with an administration, that will have strategic implications on the day after. And whether I like it or not, we are still a small country in the Middle East, and the United States of America is the only strategic ally that Israel has. The fact that I believe that this should have been an opportunity for the United States of America to do something about the Iranian nuclear program, I'll put this aside. But I think we're definitely for Israel to do something so bluntly opposing to a message of a president. The president can say don't to Iran and they will do whatever they want. But for Israel to do that, it's way more difficult, and I definitely don't want to be recommending something like that. So where does that leave us? I think what we should do in the context of where we're at is to increase our options in the future. And that would mean, in the context of what we're talking right now, to significantly degrade Iranian defensive capabilities that are complicating our ability to attack Iran in the first place, as I said in my first point. And I know that there is, I don't want to get too much into this. This is the kind of thinking that the establishment has had also in April. The fact that Israel chose, or the Prime Minister chose, to approve only a symbolic messaging, so to speak, that performed perfectly for that purpose, right? It was clear that Israel can penetrate Iranian airspace whenever we want on whatever target, while they cannot do this significantly to us. But did we degrade Iranian capabilities while we were doing that back in April 18th, I think it was? No. Should have we? I think so. So I think that's the kind of spectrum of opportunities as we should look at them. And doing something like this will also enable us in the near future to rethink some of the other options once at least some of the temporal considerations have changed, because elections will come in 4 months and a day, and there will be transition in 3 months, and other things will evolve as well. So this is how I would go about thinking about that. What would actually happen is a decision to be made by the cabinet, by the Prime Minister, and we'll see how that goes.
But everything you just said reinforces the importance of having the discussions in private as opposed to out in the open, which provides both parties, the United States and Israel, to keep our enemies on edge and uncertain about just what the response may be.
I agree.
I'll just say one other point. There are other leveraged targets out there that can affect the mindset of the Iranian people, which ought to be part of this equation. But I hesitate to get into specifics.
I'd hope that it's possible to have those conversations. There's a lot of leaking. You've done things that haven't leaked. We've done things together that didn't leak. I think of the bombing of the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007. Both governments knew about it, and it did not leak for months that it was going to happen. But there's been a lot of leaking in the last, say, 10 years, which makes me concerned that a private, very secret conversation about potential targets, will be in the New York Times in 2 days.
Yeah.
I should say that things leak for many reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The main reason things leak is because one of the partners has an interest to putting it in the press.
Yeah.
I mean, we always blame the journalists. I definitely did. But usually after I did that, it was because I was venting, because I knew that for every piece that was leaked to a journalist, there was someone who decided that it better be out there. And I think the level of distrust between the current Israeli government and the current US administration, I don't think we've ever seen something so bad in this regard. And that doesn't help any of the issues at hand.
Yeah.
So what one would hope is that a year in, there would be a vision of an end game that the region is working towards. The Emiratis, the Saudis have articulated, we want, they've gotten ever more specific as time has passed. The Israelis have indicated that they have, for the most part, mopped up operations in Gaza, except for the fact that, of course, Yahya Sinwar remains at large, as do Israel and many other nations, hostages, both alive and dead. Then we've got the problem of Lebanon, which, of course, is headed absolutely nowhere. The U.S. administration has no idea what to do in Lebanon, in my humble opinion, having heard their plans. And then we have the entire question of the West Bank, which was sort of you alluded to, and somebody has asked a very good question online, which I want to ask as well, which is, isn't this just the next powder keg? We don't like to talk about Hamas. We know, right? There's an identified terrorist organization designated by the United States and by some others, Swiss of all people, as a terrorist organization. But Fatah, no. The Palestinian Authority, no. There's still this myth that there's something else going on in the West Bank. And I heard somebody describe the Israeli devastation of the beautiful neighborhood of Jenin the other day. You clearly haven't been to Jenin, A. And B, this is a really, really big problem that looks like a more serious kind of an operation than even Gaza. What's going to happen? And from the American side, from the military side, is this sustainable for Israel? From the American side, if we end up with a democratic administration, is the administration going to continue to support Israel as it systematically goes through the West Bank and Gaza, annihilating, their enemies? And well, that's good enough, isn't it? And from the Israeli point of view, can they continue to fight? What's going to happen? Anybody can answer this, because I don't have an answer.
You know what? I don't have an answer either, but some comments. One, if you lived in the West Bank, I think you'd look at Lebanon and you'd look at Gaza and you'd think, I don't want that. I'd say the same for Jordan. I mean, the problem is not it's certainly not what the Jordanians are doing, it's what the Iranians are doing, trying to use Jordan now as a route to the West Bank. I'm struck by the way the West Bank has not blown up. When you consider what's going on in Gaza, and you consider what's going on American college campuses, it's remarkable how little we've seen in the West Bank. Now, admittedly, this is in good part because PA security forces and Israeli security forces have been extremely active. But I'm unhappily, I guess, of the opinion that it's unlikely we're going to be able to improve the status quo in the West Bank in, let's say, the coming year. Who knows where we are in 10 years, but my guess is that if you look at the West Bank 1 year from today, it'll look almost exactly the way it does today. And that's not so bad when you consider that the chances to make it a lot better seem to me to be very small, partly because of what Iran is doing, partly because of Hamas and Hezbollah, which are not eliminated yet. The chances of making it a lot worse seem to be larger. So in a sense, I would say as bad as it is, I'd take it the way it is now a year from now. Is that too pessimistic?
What I will say is a few things. And again, I mean, to say what will happen is, of course, very, very difficult. And I must admit that there are decisions that need to be made by leaders. And different leaders in the region have different opinions about what the kind of outcome they're looking at. So I can give you some principles that I think are important as when I'm engaged in planning future scenarios. What am I looking at? The first is, from an Israeli perspective, there is a tall, hard one, both social and economic, for further extension of the war. The IDF has done remarkably well, but there is a toll associated with it. It's not just the stockpiles that are depleting and the reservists who are not going to work and the months and months that are passing while hostages are not coming home, which I personally think is an essential message in our set of core values as a society to make sure that future soldiers and families of future soldiers know, and of course of civilians, that will bring them back. This used to be a very basic notion in our society, and it has been eroding dramatically over years, but specifically over the last year. So I think that there is an Israeli interest in aiming at finding a new stable situation while Hamas has been degraded heavily, maybe I should say almost decimated. And if we're able to control the smuggling from Sinai to Gaza, we can keep it that way for a long period of time, which is substantially, I mean, of course, I wish we didn't have to go through October 7 and everything that came afterwards. But to have Hamas in such a weak position is something that is good from an Israel national security standpoint. The other major proxy, or the major proxy that Iran built on our borders, which is Hezbollah, I wouldn't say decimated, not by a long shot, but degraded fundamentally. The leadership of Hezbollah is no longer. So this organization will not be what it used to be. Maybe it will be worse. I don't know what will happen with Hezbollah in 3 years. Israel cannot control the passage corridors of arms through Syria and coming from Iran in various ways. I said before that I think that there's an opportunity for Lebanon there, but that's out of Israel's reach. But if we look at it just from that direct military positioning, a year after October 7, our immediate enemies are hurt badly and way weaker than they were a year ago. This must be used properly from an Israeli standpoint. And to use that meaningfully, first, we do need to use this to end the war, because I think that's a goal in itself, because Israel needs to continue to thrive on various fronts. We cannot fight forever. And if we don't do that, we cannot divert our attention to the emerging threats that will come. I'm very worried about West. I'm very worried about what's happening there. I'm very worried about the Iranian involvement there. I'm very worried that, because Elliott, you're right, the PA has so far been very effective because it's for their interest, not because they're playing on our side in this regard, but to push down against the extremists. And maybe they can't hold much longer given the amount of money, drugs, arms, and training that Iran is pushing into the West Bank. And we need to focus for that. And we need to focus on Iran itself.
So you want to end the war in Gaza and get the hostages home, which everyone in this room wants to do. But it's becoming almost a commonplace now. It was even in the New York Times that Sinwar doesn't want to end the war.
Oh, finally.
He doesn't want to give the hostages back. Now, I mean, the obvious path to get around that is to eliminate Sinwar, which would be a very good thing to do from 1,000 points of view. But short of that, how do you end the war?
So first, I think eliminating Sinwar is a good vehicle to change the prospect of Gaza. As we've spoken before, and we mentioned Egypt and Qatar here already, Sinwar is not alone. He has two lifelines. Financial lifeline, even if it doesn't give him dividends right now, but he knows in the future that whenever he wants to replenish, there is only one actor that can supply those funds, and that's the Qataris backed by Iranian money, and the physical lifeline coming from Egypt. When Sinar asked himself this morning, how am I doing with those two lifelines? I would assume that he answered to myself, well, I'm pretty good. I mean, the Qataris haven't signaled that they are done with me, and the Egyptians definitely didn't signal that they're done with me. So I'm good. I can still fight. And I think we need to work on that. And I think we need to work on that collectively, Israel and the US. And I will say, as it comes to Gaza, that even if this doesn't work and he wants to continue to fight, we can maintain a current situation in Gaza because at the moment, there is not a real war in Gaza. There haven't been a lot of rockets. I mean, there were today because Sinwar wanted to remind everyone that it's a year for October 7. But over the last months or so, there have been very few rockets fired from Gaza to Israel because he doesn't have that many. And we can maintain this kind of arrangement. It's very different than continuing to push militarily on it and to increase the conditions to get this deal done with the hostages. There is a linkage between a deal in Gaza and a deal in Lebanon as well. Because the war in Lebanon, one must ask, how will that war end? Especially when, Israel has done so well at the moment, right? But then we started a ground invasion, and the first day we lost about 10 soldiers. And the farther we go deep into Lebanon, the more this will happen, because Lebanon is not Gaza, and we know that because we've been there before. We're a year into the war in Gaza, but just a question to the young audience here. You guys know the answer. Anyone know how long was the second Lebanese war? 35 days. After 35 days, by the way, a Republican administration, right?
Yeah.
The Bush administration. Condoleezza Rice called Prime Minister Olmert and told him, that's enough. That's enough. You've killed enough civilians over there in Kfar Kana or one of the other villages.
It was
Kana, and that's enough. 35 days. So, when I say that Israel was not built for long wars, we've really haven't been experiencing such long ones. So we also need to ask ourselves what will happen in Lebanon. And I'll add just two more remarks and then finish with this. The first is that any arrangement that will come, either in Lebanon or in Gaza, 1701, whatever new number, with or without a UN resolution, if there's a single thing that Israel needs to make sure that we control ourselves, is the verification of any such agreement. We cannot trust any international force of any sort or UN military or force of any sort to verify that. If they do, fine. But if they don't, and once we find through our intel that Hezbollah has violated any of those agreements, then the IDF needs to interdict. And we will need legitimacy for that from the United States of America. Otherwise, there is no game that we can play along those lines, and I know that this has been discussed. And the second thing that has to do with Gaza, I talked about the good things that happened in Gaza over this year on the military side of Hamas. On all the other aspects, the situation is worse than it was. Hamas now is back in control over most of Gaza Strip. Almost all of the humanitarian aid coming into Gaza ends up in Hamas's hands, and they take it to the black market and make large amounts of money out of it. Because there is no alternative that has emerged in Gaza, and I must be self-critical to say that we have not created any conditions for that either. This will also be a part of how a day after should look like, but maybe I've said enough for now.
Well, what I want to do is open it up to questions, and I've got Jim Jeffries there.
A comment and a question to Dave Deptula. The comment is, I think, Danny, that the problem with the U.S. over the last four administrations is both less and more serious than you said. It isn't a lack of commitment, as Eyal could talk about. We have a massive commitment in the region. We have a massive number of troops. They've been actually fighting on the side of Israel from time to time. We've got bases in 10, 11, 12 countries. $10 billion, not counting what we've recently sent Israel in annual security and other assistance. It's a big program, and everybody understands, in their sleep, the various reasons why the Middle East is important, and you pivot away, you pivot back. But it isn't that we can't do strategies. We did an effective strategy against the Islamic State. We did an effective strategy to take down Saddam, albeit the day after wasn't so hot. And we did an effective strategy against Al-Qaeda. What we don't have, and I'm trying to put my finger on, and this is hard, but to the extent I can, what we don't have is an effective strategy against Iran. Some of that is, as Elliott knows, he and I were doing this for 20 years, there's a debate over the nature of Iran in a way there isn't a debate here over China or Russia. But leave that to one side. The main thing, and I just read an Angela Mitchell comment, and it's the 500th time I've heard it last year, regional war, catastrophe, massive war. The Iranians have managed to convince us to take serious military action off the table on the idea that they have escalation dominance, whereas we're not seeing escalation dominance with Israel. Just like we, for years, didn't go into Syria because of the massive air defense, and then we saw Israel going into Syria all the time, and then we started flying it. But I'll leave that to one side. So the thing, Dave, is what would a regional war, which is essentially going to be an air war, because I rule out a ground war, and we saw what happened in 1988, 89 with a sea war. What would a regional air war with Iran look like? And I know that's a big subject, but it's something that we got to talk about in the U.S., or else we take that half of the strategy off, so we're left with a negotiate with guys who really don't want to negotiate strategy. And anyway, I'll leave it there.
It's a fascinating question. It's one that I'd hesitate to get into too many details with publicly for obvious reasons, but I think you raised some excellent points in the context of having the options set up to be able to execute and having the Iranians understand what the consequences of their actions are. This is what takes me back to my original comments with respect to deterrence. Your adversary is not going to be deterred if you don't take actions with respect to answering the question. If the President of the United States says don't and Iran does, what's your response? If it's nothing, then all you're doing is encouraging them to continue to act. So I know that's not a specific answer to your question, but I think it's one that the follow-on administrations need to consider before they come into power, because they're going to have to deal with it.
But can I follow up on Jim's question? We talk a lot about Iranian capabilities through their proxies, and we talk a lot about Iranian air defenses, and we talk a lot about their nuclear weapons program. We don't really talk a lot about their Air Force.
Piece of cake. Put me in, coach. I'll just leave it at that. But real quick, in the waning minutes, I just want to throw one thing out and kind of bring what's happened in Israel back to the discussion space with respect to U.S. national security. We just saw, 180 plus ballistic missiles launched against Israel. This last round, 120 or 30 in April. Okay, what happens if a adversary happens to launch that number of ballistic missiles against the United States? What do we have to defend ourselves with? 40 ground-based interceptors. That's the reality. And oh, by the way, we're going to replace them with an advanced version, and we're going to buy 31 of those. How are we doing? We've got to address the fact that missile defense is a real subject that ought to be entertained with respect to the needs of America's security. And I haven't even raised the issue of regional defense of our forward operating locations, which are critical across all the services in a variety of different locations around the world. And I'll just throw in there that the United States military is half or less than half the strength that it had when we fought Saddam in 1991. Now, do you think the panoply of threats against the United States is less than or greater than those posed by Saddam in 1991? Yet, strong national security is not even a talking point in the top 10 talking points of either of the presidential candidates today.
Amen to that. This was a really interesting question. Whenever Western military officials travel to Israel, we hear the exact same thing, that the Israeli military has done an exemplary job in doing its best under the circumstances, civilian human shields, things like that, underground tunnels, built-in schools, hospitals, etc., to actually preserve civilian life. Why is it that we hear that from responsible British, American, Aussie officials who know the military, and yet everybody else says there's a genocide going on?
Well, a combination of three reasons. One, intentional disinformation. Two, ignorance. And three, anti-Semitism.
There you go.
All right? Those three
1, 2, 3.
combined. And that's the reason.
That's a great answer.
And 100%
Drop
true.
the mic.
Right, mic drop. Oh, another one. We've talked about the job that the Palestinian Authority is doing and the security forces are doing in tamping down the threats to security in the West Bank. But the PA is a dead letter. I mean, Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas is a dead letter. There's no obvious successor to him. I talked with somebody the other day about the old Martin Indyk suggestion from the early 2000s about having a technocratic external force that would govern in sort of British mandatory style, except less anti-Semitic. What's the future of the PA? What happens? Because, I mean, otherwise, we don't have a ready-made next, do we?
Well, we don't, certainly. The United States doesn't.
Maybe Israel does.
There
Yeah.
isn't. There are two factions. I was going to say parties. Party is the wrong word in the West Bank. One of them being Hamas, which turned itself overnight in the 2006 elections into a political party.
Right.
So let's call it a party in addition to being a terrorist group and an army, though the army part is pretty well gone at this point. And then there's Fatah, which was never a political party. It was a vehicle for Arafat. And when it tried to be a political party and run, it didn't do very well. And it's worse now because it's at least as corrupt and at least as out of touch. So it's a kind of, in a way, it is a colonial imposition on the West Bank in the sense that it's not of the people, it controls the people, it's on top of the people. It governs them, it steals their money. It
steals our money too.
Yeah. Every opinion poll that's been taken in the last decade has the same result. We want, from Palestinians, we want Abbas out. These people are thieves. We have no confidence in them. So the question in the West Bank is almost the question of Gaza, which is, how do you build a governing structure that is competent, that is decent? Let's put aside the word democratic for the moment, that people have confidence in because the people in it are trying to do well, trying to do good for the people of the country, of the entity, whatever you want to call it. The last time somebody tried that, it was Salam Fayyad, and in the election, he got 2 or 3% of the vote. So you're almost in a situation where you want a trusteeship. Mm-hmm. That's not going to happen. So again, I think the best we can do is start thinking about what could we and others, maybe the EU, maybe the Arab states, do to help put together a competent governing structure of the Fayyad variety that would make life better in the West Bank, that would have a government that is not a government of thieves, and that would be trying to help the people of the West Bank and trying to help the economy there. We did it once. The we here is the United States government, and we did it by shoving it down the throats of the people leading Fatah. And that may be the only way to do it.
By the way, this was done twice. I completely agree with everything Elliott said on this, or on everything you said in general. The US has done that twice. The first time they've done it is shoving Abu Mazen in the throat of Arafat and placing him as a prime minister. And then they did it again when they shoved Salam Fayyad in the throat of Abu Mazen as a prime minister. The only thing I'll add is that there was an opportunity for that earlier in the year, but because of a policy of de-escalation at all costs, what the administration chose to do is to endorse the person that Abu Mazen installed as a prime minister, Mohammed Mustafa. And they did this while all the pragmatic Arab countries around told them not to do it. The Emiratis said, we can't work with him, he's a money launderer. The Saudis said, don't do this because we can't work with him. And yet again, this is what a state recommended and the White House approved. So sometimes you have opportunities, but when what you want is to de-escalate at all costs, you cannot sustain the heat of opportunities.
And on that chipper note, it looks like the year ahead is not going to promise to be much easier than the year that has come. But I am very grateful to you for joining us and for everything that you do, and for our friends in the audience as well. Won't you please join me in thanking our three guests? Thank you.
So, Danny, what do you think?
I love these guys. I think it was a wonderful conversation, thoughtful, insightful, and I wish I could say that we came up with all the solutions, but one of the things that really stood out to me, one of the things that annoyed the living daylights out of me, is this conversation that we had about what it is that recipients of U.S. aid, recipients of U.S. defense guarantees, recipients of U.S. defense support are doing to help end this conflict. The Egyptians, who have been probably the number one weapons lifeline to Hamas, absolutely no pressure from the Biden administration. The Qataris, who have been the most important financial lifeline to Hamas, and obviously where the former Hamas leadership, the late Hamas leadership, used to live, but certainly where their money still lives, got a renewal of a 10-year renewal of the U.S. Air Base at Al Udeid. For what? I just look at what's happening in the region and how countries are turning against the United States, doing what is probably not in their own interests, but all because they are getting no pressure from the United States. There's no quid pro quo. You take tens of billions of dollars in U.S. assistance, tens of billions of dollars in U.S. defense, and you just pocket it. I don't get it, but I think this is the Europe story. I think this is the story throughout the world.
You sound like Donald Trump.
I know, I do.
Our allies are taking advantage of us. They're taking our money. We're not getting anything for it. He's got a point. And we're getting ripped off, and we're not demanding anything in exchange for it. So it's not a ripoff if they do our cruel bidding, right? Then it's an investment.
It's a quid pro quo, and the answer is no. This is in your interest. You should be spending more for your own defense. I'm helping you defend your own interest. It's not about you owe us more money. It's actually about him encouraging them to do what is in their best interest. And the same is true in the region. Nobody in the region benefits from the existence of Iran, this regime, and its proxies. And yet somehow we don't help them be their best selves, even though we're defending them, coughing up billions in U.S. taxpayer dollars for them. It's not payback. This is not for us. This is not for the Jews. This is for freaking them.
It's both.
Well, yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah, it's both. You're right. We're trying to get them to do something in their self-interest, but the reality is they look at it and say their self-interest is for us to carry the burden, right?
But we're not carrying the burden.
Well,
we are not carrying the burden. We are carrying the financial burden. But in terms of what's necessary, we're not going to defend them from the Iranians when push comes to shove. We're not going to do what it takes to defend them. They need to do more for themselves. And this is the argument that you made at the outset of this conversation about the Israelis, which is, look, no one cares more about the fate of the Jewish people and the state of Israel than the government of the state of Israel, period. I don't care how much America is pro-Israel. I don't care how good the president is, which president it is. No one cares more about it than the state of Israel, and they need to do the right thing. And they're being talked out of it by the U.S. government. These other guys are not being asked to do it by the U.S. government. What's the common denominator here? We suck.
The U.S. government. Yeah.
Right, we suck.
The Biden-Harris administration sucks. That's the common denominator.
Well, I hope that the guy that you voted for won't suck, because I think he's going to win the election.
We will see how that turns out. Hey, look, before we go, one thing we wanted to tell everybody is we are going to start at the end of these podcasts to read some of your comments and questions. And I know we get lots of them on the Substack and sometimes in the comments on Apple Podcasts and other places. So if you have questions or comments on previous episodes, we'd love to engage with you on them. Send them our way. Comment on the Substack. You can send us an email. You can email us at whatthehell@aei.org. And let us know your thoughts. We're going to answer your questions and read some of your comments on the air. I think it'll be fun.
It
make
will
fun
be
of Danny.
fun. Yes, you can make fun of me. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of your comments and Mark's, as usual, incisive responses. Take care, everybody.
See you next week.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.